it is not uncommon for female soldiers to be assigned alongside male soldiers in the combat areas. But it was not always this way. From the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, when women dressed as men in order to serve, to today, when women are assigned to combat roles and serve in high-ranking positions, slowly women's roles expanded. In the 1970s, women could be assigned to command non-combat units. Women and men began training together. In 1994, women served in all positions except those engaged in direct combat roles. In 2013, women achieved full status when they were granted the right to serve in direct combat roles. Women graduated from both the Army's Elite Ranger School and the Army's Elite Sniper School. They can enroll in the Navy SEAL program, and they have been appointed to 4-star general positions. At the 2023 Super Bowl, the Navy flyover was performed by all female pilots. And on November 2nd, 2023, Navy Admiral Lisa Franchetti was confirmed as the new Chief of Naval Operations. She is the first woman to sit on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During the First World War, women other than nurses were not officially part of the military. Any roles that they served were as volunteers, such as communication specialists or dietitians. But because they were volunteers, they had no official status. The concept of a woman in uniform was difficult for the American public of the 1940s to accept. And that's my mother marching. She's in the front row, the woman wearing glasses. However, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the United States entrance into World War II, women's roles began to change. Congress passed a bill on May 14, 1942, to form the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAAC. Since they were an auxiliary corps, they did not have the same access to legal benefits and protection as the soldiers in the Army. Because so many men were going to war, it became apparent that women's participation in the war effort was essential. Many women learned new skills in industrial jobs. Hence, Rosie the Riveter. Other women joined the military effort because good clerical and secretarial skills were extremely desirable. The Army discovered an added bonus. One WAC typist could replace 2 men while eating half as much food as 1 man. Once General Eisenhower brought the Auxiliary Corps to North Africa in January 1943, and their efficiency became known, requests for them increased in Europe prior to D-Day. But if these women were being sent overseas, they needed the protection of being part of the Army. So in July 1943, after much debate, another bill was passed in Congress, giving women in the Army full military benefits, and they became the WACs, WAC, Women's Army Corps. WACs were an essential part of the fighting forces in World War II, even though they were not in combat. They handled highly classified material, worked long hours with few days off, and were exposed to a significant amount of danger. They assisted in the planning of D-Day and subsequent operations. To meet the European theater's heavy demands for skilled typists and stenographers, recruiting was stepped up. The All States campaign and the Job Station campaign. In the first, General Marshall asked state governors to assign committees of prominent citizens the task of recruiting statewide companies for the WWII, who would carry their state flags and wear their own state armbands while in training. And my mother was from Detroit, Michigan. This is the armband that she wore. Her family didn't throw anything out. And he's pretending to be Vanna White. The Job Station campaign allowed recruiters to promise prospective enlistees their choice of duty and assignment location after they completed basic training. There were about 150,000 WWICs serving in the Army. 20,000 served overseas, and of those, about 8,000 were serving in the European Theater of Operations. And my mother was one of those 8,000. Serving overseas was considered such a privilege that many WWICs gave up promotions and more interesting stateside assignments. This included a battalion commanded by Major Charity Adams of 855 African American WWICs who were assigned in February 1945 to the Central Postal Battalion in Birmingham, England. There was such a backlog of mail, and the Army decided they had to do something to ease the problem. Since mail was a very important part of a soldier's life and lifeline to their family back home. These WWICs were responsible for the redirecting of mail to all of the U.S. personnel in the European Theater of Operations. And this included Army, Navy, Marines, civilians, and Red Cross workers, over 7 million people. Their motto was no mail, low morale. When mail could not be delivered to the address on the envelope, it was sent to the postal directory to be redirected. They processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail per shift. And at one point, there were 7,500 Robert Smiths. They manually updated the information card for each person in this theater. They worked so quickly that they then moved to France to continue sorting mail. And remember, this was all done without the use of computers. In March 2022, President Biden signed into law a bill awarding the women of the 6th 888 Battalion the Congressional Gold Medal. And now Tyler Perry is in the process of making a movie based on their story. All of these groundbreaking women who joined the military paved the way for future generations of women in the military. Imagine you are a young woman in the 1940s. The world's involvement in World War II, as well as America's, had been raging on for several years. The media continued with their campaign to urge women into the workforce. Here is a quote from the women's recruiting movement of the 1940s. Never in history has there been such an urgent need for American women to serve their country. This is total war, a war in which every woman, as well as every man, must play a part. My mother had several reasons for enlisting in the WWII, in addition to her patriotic duty. A favorite cousin was killed in the South Pacific in a flying accident early in the war. 2 of her girlfriends enlisted. And then she looked around and said, there won't be any men left my age. I might as well join. And at the time she was 27, so she was a little bit older than a lot of the people enlisting. At first, when she tried to enlist, she was rejected because of low weight. She weighed less than 100 pounds. In order to enlist, you had to be at least 5 feet tall, weigh 100 pounds, and have at least 12 teeth. You have to ask your dentist about that one. She went home and fattened herself up. Then she was accepted into the WWII in September 1943 and on her way to a new adventure in wartime Europe. Our journey to writing and publishing a book began when my mother enlisted in the WWII. My mother wrote extensively to her sister, although wartime military censorship prevented any detailed discussion. Her sister saved this correspondence. My mother was in the medical intelligence section in the Army, which was established by the Army Surgeon General to provide medical and health-related information about the areas in which the Army was preparing to move into so that medical services would be ready for the conditions they would find when the troops arrived. My mother's responsibilities included determining the availability of hospital beds for the next military operation and working as a stenographer for a senior medical officer. She took dictation on medical intelligence activities on belligerent nations, handled all secret and confidential material, maintained all files. There was an article about medical intelligence in Collier's magazine and reprinted in the Reader's Digest in 1943. I was able to locate a copy of that article. In summary, medical intelligence was the difference between an army ready for action and an army ready for the hospital. And this was all accomplished without the use of instant access and the internet. They relied on old information from World War I, maps, and local civilian accounts. Mollie's War recreates a world that existed more than 75 years ago by taking you through the romantic and always frightful journey of an American WWII during the height of World War II. It is not a tale of life on the battlefield, but rather a tale of the battlefield of life and love. This collection of vivid letters recounts my mother's experiences. Mollie's story documents the human side of life during the war, a life that alternates between fear and romance, exhaustion and leisure. She was assigned and completed basic training in Daytona Beach, Florida, which was the second training camp for WWICs after the Army discovered the harsh winters in Iowa. In Florida, you usually didn't need winter clothes. My mother found basic training to be very intense, but she learned to follow orders. She endured the strict regimen entailed in such training, just the same as the male soldiers. Learning military protocol, how to march in step, how to salute, how to fire a gun, how to navigate the obstacle course, how to keep their belongings organized, and how to make all of these new tasks into habits so ingrained that they would require no thought during their service. Then her first assignment was in Wilmington, California, where on the day she arrived, as luck would have it, Warner Brothers Studio was just finishing up a WWIC recruiting film, and she became an extra. Here is an excerpt from the letter that she wrote home about her role in the film. 12 February 1944. Dear Beck, all we WWICs assembled in the Port Theater for the premiere showing of It's Your War Too. Before the picture was shown, our commanding officer made a little speech and said that many of the scenes were cut out, not because they were bad, but because of the continuity and because it was necessary to make it short. I naturally thought the brief scenes I was in were cut. because I had come in on the last day and there were no retakes on my dramatic scenes. I was watching the picture as it progressed. It's really just a group of scenes. And my gal friend sitting next to me said, "There you are." It was funny that I had hardly recognized myself. It was the coverall scene. I don't look too hot, but it's not too bad. Then I saw myself in the conference scene. But anyway, it was quite a thrill to see it. When we got through with seeing the picture, we came back to the barracks, ate supper, and got our clean linens. Then we all set to work, cleaning and scrubbing for Saturday's inspection. There are no temperamental stars in our barracks. This WWII recruiting film was shown in movie theaters during World War II before the feature film.
Hey, there goes one of those petticoat soldiers now.
Yeah. My sister wants to join the WWII. What do you think of that?
Huh. She's crazy. What the devil's a woman want to be a soldier for?
Just a waste of time. This is a man's war. What sort of jobs can they do?
What sort of jobs can we do? Take a look, mister. X-ray technicians, inspectors of Army meat, teachers schooling our soldiers, WWIIs are classification experts, assignment interviewers.
So this is a man's war, is it? WWIIs are at work on every sort of Army vehicle, doing every sort of motor transport job, testing walkie-talkies, testing radio tubes. Those are just a few of the jobs they do. There are 239 more. Hey, you two armchair generals on the porch, here's something more for you to think about. Listen.
General Eisenhower said, "In many jobs, WWIIs do the work of two men. The Army needs and can use all it can get."
And listen to the women of the United Nations. They too have some ideas on the subject. The English with their calm courage, the stalwart women of heroic Russia, the Canadian and Australian women, the women of China with their undying fortitude, and tens of thousands of American WWIIs. What are their ideas on the subject? Listen.
We shall live up to the legends of our fighting men.
Where did these thousands come from? Where will the United States Army get thousands more? Thousands to back up manpower for battle abroad. Who are the women who will help retain the needed manpower for the production battle at home? Who are the women who will help fight our country's war? It's Mary Jones and Jane Doe. It's the idle housewife and the girl next door. Oh yes, it's your war too, Miss and Mrs. America.
Here at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, one of the most beautiful Army posts in the world, we, the newly hatched WWIIs, gather to learn what all the shooting's about. Our kind of shooting. From morning till night, we hustle through a very novel, interesting life. Not just classes and drill and duty, but all kinds of women's sports and recreation. We work hard and play hard. We learn that the Army's privileges as well as its hardships are ours. We get furlough rates on trains, special prices at theaters, special life insurance rates. We know that the rumors about the wax are so much hot air.
All the time. Talking stockings
Scratch
all the time.
that one
Talking
out.
stockings all the time.
Off-duty, rayon, or whatever you can get.
You can't use makeup.
No rouge.
No lipstick.
No nail polish. No rouge.
No lipstick.
No nail polish.
No rouge. No lipstick.
No nail polish. No rouge.
Toss that one in the ash can.
Everybody's hair is alike. The same old hairdo, the same old hairdo, the same
Nonsense. Our hairdress is up to us as long as it's neat, smart, and off the collar.
All work and no fun. All work and no fun.
Strictly Axis propaganda.
From wax training centers at Fort Oglethorpe and at Des Moines, wax go forth to army posts, camps, specialist schools, air bases, to every part of the United States. Savannah, St. Louis, Newport, Baton Rouge, Seattle, Santa Barbara. To Washington, our nation's capital, come hundreds of wax, many to be stationed in the famous Pentagon building and attached to the combined chiefs of staff. Wax are entrusted with tasks involving the utmost secrecy. Here, the important work of decoding messages whose information must be carefully guarded and transcribed with perfect accuracy. At Aberdeen Proving Grounds, valuable men have been released for combat duty by wax, inspecting mammoth tanks, computing ordnance firing tables for the light, accurate American carbines, the carbines that have canceled the effectiveness of many a Nazi and many a Jap. Here, they also check the efficiency of remote control units and make secret ballistic measurements. These are just a few of the important and interesting jobs done by wax. At air bases here and overseas, women soldiers perform over 25 technical jobs. War jobs now, but civilian careers later on.
We are in the machine shop, in the repair shop. We rig the parachute. We guide our flyers home.
Altitude 5,000 feet. 5000. Request landing instructions.
Mitchell Field Tower to Army 3131. Circle field twice at 3,000 feet.
Let me in, will you? I've got a heavy date tonight.
Keep your chute on, Lieutenant. Field won't be clear for 5 minutes.
Potential American pilots are taught blind flying by our wax. They are taught to handle night raids over Europe and the Black Pacific, taught to navigate safely through black space, loaded with hidden peril. Thousands of wax volunteer for overseas duty, eager to serve in the actual theater of operations, the goal toward which they've worked and trained. Wherever the American armies will go, wax may follow. Women have proven their definite value in England, in North Africa, in Algiers, in New Caledonia, India, and Egypt. Every whack making the war shorter by a month, a week, a day, a minute. Yes, wherever the American armies will go, wax may follow. To Berlin and Tokyo, too. Ladies and gentlemen, General Marshall.
The Women's Army Corps is an integral part of the Army of the United States, and its members, who are soldiers in every sense of the word, perform a full military part in this war. There are hundreds of important Army jobs which women can perform as effectively as men. In fact, we find that they can do some of these jobs much better than the men. As more and more American soldiers engage the enemy in combat, women must replace them at overseas bases and at posts in this country. In view of the urgency of the situation, enlistment in the military service should take precedence, in my opinion, over any other responsibility except imperative family obligation.
In 1918, we were on the sidelines.
war has been won, the women in the Army will march shoulder to shoulder with the men in the great victory parades that will celebrate the return of peace to the world.
After her assignment in Wilmington, California, my mother went back home to Detroit on leave. And this is a picture of my mother with her mother and her older sister, Rebecca. And most of her letters were written to her sister, Rebecca. Then she went to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, which was a staging area for wax going overseas. She was stationed in England before the D-Day invasion began, and also while the country was under bombardment by the unmanned German bombs. And my mother is the fourth person marching in this picture. Censorship prevented her from discussing her job, but here is an interesting letter. Yesterday, I went to see Madame Tussaud's famous waxworks. It's amazing how lifelike those figures are. In fact, as I walked in, I started to speak to a girl attendant to ask where we could purchase programs. And I was most chagrined when I discovered it was a wax figure. I turned around to see if anyone had noticed my slight error. Then I walked cautiously about and decided not to speak to any of the attendants. You can imagine my further embarrassment when we were about halfway through the exhibition and started to go on to another floor. I edged up pretty close to a figure at the head of the stairs and stared at it quite frankly. And then he spoke to me. It was a male attendant, and I understand he has been fooling the public for about 15 years. Although I can't tell you anything about my job, other than it is medics and is now secretarial, it is most interesting. My mother's work continued in London as the preparations for D-Day, June 6, 1944, completed. D-Day was the largest military operation in history that the Allies launched against occupied France on the beaches of Normandy. It is now after D-Day, and the Allies have made great strides into the occupied France. In retaliation, Hitler scientists have developed unmanned fantastic flying machines, V-1 rockets, also called buzz bombs or doodlebugs, that were launched by the Germans from somewhere along the French and Dutch coasts with just enough fuel to reach London and then randomly crash land somewhere in the city. London is constantly under attack. When these attacks first began, WACs were frightened and would seek protection in the air raid shelters. But soon they learned that they could wait out the air raids in their apartments. The bombings became a part of their daily routine, and they just went on with their lives. Even as my mother was getting ready for work, she didn't stop her preparations as the doodlebugs went gliding overhead. But my mother said they were terrified when the bombs were sent at night, and then the next morning they were happy to be alive. They would look around and see all the bombed out areas surrounding them. Here is the letter that she wrote home after Winston Churchill's speech, telling the world of the German attacks by the buzz bombs. 26 July, 1944, London, England. Dear Beck, by the way, I wasn't going to write to say I was in London because I knew you would all worry. And if you promise not to say anything to Mom and Pop, I will reveal a few interesting items. Restrictions on the doodlebug situation, as far as our mail is concerned, have been lifted somewhat since Churchill's speech. In fact, I could have written a few weeks ago about it, but held off. But now I've gotten to a point where I feel a lot of those people back home who sit back complacently ought to know there is a real war going on. And Beck, I see it every day. The air raid sirens are a real sound to us during the day as well as the night. And it means the real thing over here. Those darn buzz bombs come a-floating round. They have been our unwelcome visitors both day and night since approximately 1 week after D-Day. I am sure that many of the people I write to think, because I only write of pleasant things, that there is nothing else that enters into our little lives. I don't believe the people back home can grasp any part of the situation over here. I, of course, have many incidents to relate, which will have to wait until I see you. However, this one, through the courtesy of the censor, I know you will find interesting. One night, after a particularly busy day at the office, I was sleeping most soundly at the billets. It happened to be in the early days of those confounded things. Well, anyway, their roar was terrific, and yet I slept. I noticed a heavy feeling on my head and awoke drowsily to feel my bunkmate holding onto my hand and sitting on my bed. She had placed my helmet on my head, and we both listened for the darn motor to shut off. And fortunately, it didn't land where we expected it to. You can bet your boots we both felt to see if we were wearing our dog tags. Another sight always gives me a peculiar feeling and really penetrates. When I see the busloads of children being evacuated from London to safer places, having separated from family and friends. Taking it all in all, it really is a great experience and certainly makes one appreciate the good old USA more than you can realize. I know you are anxious about me, but don't be, because for some reason, I am most calm about it. Even if I had the opportunity to go home right now, I don't believe I would take it. No, not until this war is really over. She was among the first WWIIs to enter Normandy after the D-Day invasion. The WWIIs followed closely behind the fighting forces, slept in the field in tents, on army cots, ate field rations, and took baths in their helmets with cold water. It was here on the beaches of Normandy where they did not know if the location where they slept had been a battlefield. She used her 4 years of high school French to converse with the civilians and learned about the terrible conditions they had lived under the German occupation. She actually paid attention in high school, learned and remembered her French. She was transferred to Paris a few weeks after it was liberated by the Allies and frequently served as an informal interpreter in both work and social related situations. And here is an excerpt from another letter. Paris, France, 16 September, 1944. I know that you wonder how I'm getting along with the French language. I'm doing wonderfully well. In fact, yesterday, I acted as an interpreter. Last night, a number of us went to the Arc de Triomphe. We wanted to go up into it and see the view of Paris, but the guard there said we could not at that time as it was closed for the public. Perhaps later, he said. All that in French, and he could not speak a word of English. Then we walked away. We didn't get very far when I heard a shuffling of feet and turned around. There was the guard making a beeline for me with an Air Corps captain in his tow. The captain asked me if I could speak French, and I said, a little. He asked me to ask the guard several questions, and I translated the answers. It was great fun, and I understood everything. They were trying to determine whether our pilots had flown any planes under the arc, which was against regulations. Anyway, the answer was no, at least for this guard. My mother enjoyed experiencing French culture because, unlike many of the Americans stationed in Paris during the war, she was able to understand enough French to go to French films and theater and to follow the dialogue. She was able to travel the city on public transportation and on foot because she could read the street names and understand directions. She also read the French newspapers and said that it added to her vocabulary. She was still stationed in Paris on VE Day, May 8th, 1945, and took part in the revelry of the celebration. She commented in a letter written after VE Day that it's so wonderful to feel every plane flying over is friendly. Right after VE Day, my mother wrote home in a letter, "Frankly, I don't know what the Army will do with us, but please don't think just because VE Day has been declared, all I have to do is run out to the docks and grab a boat home. The Army doesn't operate like that." Very soon after VE Day, a new theme appeared in my mother's letters, probably a theme in every soldier's letters, that of the point system. Although there was a point system for discharge, there could be other extenuating factors. Starting in June 1945, my mother wrote that stenos and typists have been declared essential in this theater, no matter how many points you have. The point system theme continued in her letters home throughout July and August. She was still with medical intelligence, and they were the department who reviewed the extensive records that the Nazis left, claiming that their experiments were done to enhance medical research. They found that this was not true. After living in Paris, she was transferred to Versailles, where she lived a country life for about a month and even worked in a horse stable. The stable had been converted into offices for the U.S. Army. My mother was always sending French perfume home to her family. Because she was working in a horse stable, her mother wrote to her and said, "Keep the perfume. You need it." In August 1945, she was transferred to Germany with the Army of Occupation and witnessed firsthand the devastation of the country. In a letter written from Frankfurt, my mother commented, "Although the European war has been over for some time, there is a great deal of cleaning up yet to be done. They are still digging through the debris in the bombed buildings. Frankfurt is still quite a mess, even though they say it has been all cleaned up. All the bricks have been piled high, so they make a fence around what used to be buildings." In September, my mother writes again about points. "So, what I want to bring out is this. I don't have one darn thing to say about it, and I am not kidding. I didn't want to go to Germany and just lacked 2 points. I saw colonels and captains galore. As far as being essential, the stenos are no longer in that category." Finally, in early October, my mother gets the word that she will be leaving Frankfurt to go home. After serving with the Army of Occupation, my mother began her trek back to the USA in October 1945. She and other WACs took a train from Germany through France. They crossed the English Channel and arrived in London. Then they boarded the Queen Mary on November 3rd in Southampton. The Queen Mary, a luxury ocean liner built in 1936, but put into service in 1942 as a troop ship, was the fastest ship in the world at that time. She was very useful during World War II because she could outrun the German submarines and torpedoes. And in fact, Hitler put a bounty on this ship of $250,000 for any German U-boat commander who could successfully torpedo and sink it. The Queen Mary is now a tourist attraction and hotel located in Long Beach, California. My mother and her fellow service men and women set sail on the morning of November 4th. After less than 5 days at sea, my mother awoke at 2:30 in the morning on November 9th and went on deck to hear Tommy Dorsey and Martha Ray welcoming them home and to see an illuminated Statue of Liberty in the midst of darkness. She knew she was home. The close friendships that my mother formed with her fellow WWIIs were typical of the experiences of many women serving in the Army during World War II who found a special camaraderie there. Over the years, my mother corresponded with her 4 closest WWII buddies. But in October 2007, my mother received a letter from Lodo's daughter saying that Lodo had passed away. Lodo was the last of my mother's close WWII friends. I knew that this was the time to write the book with my mother. She was 91 and really wanted to share her story. I had a suitcase of letters that my mother wrote home. For some reason, her family didn't throw out her stuff. Included in that suitcase were lots of memorabilia, about 350 letters, newspaper clippings, and photos, which fortunately my mother had labeled with names, dates, and location. Writing a book based on letters from the 1940s was a formidable task. In order to actually be able to use these letters in a book, I needed to read them and to transcribe them, about 1,000 pages typed. I also needed to be familiar with the content of the letters so I would have a general idea of what I could edit out for a book. Nobody would want to read 1,000 pages of letters. It became a family project as my husband, sister, daughter, and son all helped. My uncle, my mother's younger brother, read the first draft. My mother said she didn't need to read the draft because she was there. Because of censorship, my mother could not write about her work or where she was located. Many letters indicated somewhere in England, somewhere in France. She could only write about pleasant events, sightseeing, and boyfriends. Even as I was transcribing the letters, I began going to the Pritzker Military Library in downtown Chicago. I needed to put historical context around the letters so the book would put proper perspective of the events occurring at that time. Because of the historical nature of the subject matter, the head librarian thought it was important to find a traditional publisher and not to self-publish. A traditional publisher would vet the book and give credence to the accuracy of the information contained in it. In June 2008, she helped me find McFarland Publishers, a leading U.S. publisher of nonfiction books located in North Carolina. They were planning on launching a series of books about women in the military, and they thought my mother's experiences would be excellent to begin their series. But then I didn't hear from them for quite a while. I also tried to contact the people who played a prominent role in my mother's life during the war. It was an amazing journey as I connected with some of the people or their children, and we have become email buddies and even Facebook friends. When McFarland Publishers finally offered my mother and me a contract in May 2009, I had the book written, 150,000 words. We accepted the contract and they assigned us an editor from Wales. The publisher wanted at most 110,000 words, so we had some very serious editing to do. We communicated strictly via the internet. Through the miracle of modern technology, I never met my editor nor my publishers, and yet we negotiated a contract, edited, and published an entire book. My mother passed away in April 2012 at the age of 95. But seeing the smile on her face when she held her book in her hand was priceless. Peppered throughout her letters was the fact that she always wanted to write a book, and it happened only 65 years later. Working with my mother on this project was a very strange experience. It is impossible to know what your parents were like before they became parents, but using my mother's actual letters and photos felt like being transported by time machine to another era. Reading my mother's words and seeing the photos of my mother as a young, carefree woman who made decisions for herself and traveled the world during the most treacherous time of all made me realize the full life that she had before she became a wife and mother. I think so many of us never have the opportunity to see our mothers and fathers as well as people separate from the family. The woman in these letters was not the mother that I knew when I was growing up. She was a very different person when she got married and had a family. Sometimes we forget about the role that women played in the Second World War. Women stepped up and were able to make a significant contribution to the war effort, both at home and in the military. These American women showed courage in helping the fighting men, sharing in the disappointments of the soldiers, celebrating their successes, and finally rejoicing in the complete victory. They responded to the challenge and achieved their mission. They also served. With fewer and fewer of these female veterans still alive, this is a story that has its place in the history of women in the military. Thank you. If there are any questions, first of all, the first question I always ask, is there anybody who served in the military? Okay, and if you'd like to tell a little bit. Do we need a microphone?
Thank you, Peggy. Yes, my name is Bridget Rice, and I had the privilege of serving in the Air Force for 8 years, from 1990 to 1998. I was an aircraft mechanic. I worked on F-111Es, the F-111s, and U-2s. And so seeing some of these trailblazing women that were just, I have chills, even just as I was watching the presentation. So thank you so much. Your mother was very blessed to have someone interested in her story to do as much work as you did to get her story out to us. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your service.
Oh, it was my honor. Thank you.
And there was someone else? Yes.
Yeah, Richard Matthews. I was in the 1st Infantry Division doing my service in Fort Riley until we got notice to go to Vietnam. Went across the Pacific in a World War II Liberty ship. Wow. The whole division went over. And I got a book out of it. 50 years later, just recently, I wrote a book called Short, which is about my time in Vietnam. Short meaning you don't have much time left. 25 days and wake up kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
So that's my
Thank you
service.
for your service. Yes.
Well, I did not serve, but however, this reminds me very much of my mother, who in 1943 was asked to come to the University of Illinois and help form, it was either wax or waves, I don't remember. But unfortunately, she had very weak eyes. So she took the physical and they said, sorry, you can't do this. So a little while later, she was asked to come and do electrical engineering at the University of Illinois to help support the war effort. And it just so happens that the Genealogical Society of Southern Illinois, if you are not a member, you should be. They just published a article about my mother and her service. She went to the University of Illinois. She already had a master's degree and took 2 years of electrical engineering in 6 months. And then she became an electrical engineering assistant and was sent to Wright Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And she lived with a group of women in a big old mansion there as an apartment and worked and designed manuals and equipment to radio aircraft, the 2 big bombers that they were using at that time. They did the complete package of the instructions to install it and all the equipment all boxed up nice and neat to send it to the pilots in the field to install it. So she worked there throughout the war. And then like your mother, she came home and she got married and she moved to Ridgeway in Gallatin County, little tiny town. She thought she'd fallen off the ends of the earth, but she had a great time raising her family.
You have to be so proud of your mother.
She was wonderful.
Yes. There was one time we were doing a presentation, and there was this woman who talked about her father who had very poor eyesight. And every time he would go to do the physical, he would fail it with the eyesight. So finally, he memorized the eye chart. And then the next time when he went, he passed. So, yes.
I wanted to take just a moment to honor my deceased mother-in-law for her service. She served with Colonel Kruger in either Guam or the Philippines, I'm not sure which, and served as a steno. So this brought back some memories in thinking of her. And then she met her future husband there. He was a soldier. And she was married, and Colonel Kruger gave her away actually in a church. So that was kind of neat.
Yes.
And then she was married in a parachute that had been partially destroyed in the war. So they didn't have, the silk to make the wedding dresses. So my family saved that, and it was kind of a neat story, I thought. So I miss her. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Attending any event at the Carbondale Library. I'm a professor of literature, and I was very familiar with the war fiction, but I have never seen such excellent presentation where you made her come alive in front of our eyes.
Thank you.
It was done beautifully, and especially I think it was love's labor. The sentiments of a daughter and the way you made this research and the way you were familiar with it was really excellent, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.
My father-in-law was in the military. He was in the Army. He was supposed to be in a district unit because most of them had disabilities of some sort or another. And they were supposed to be stateside, but they sent him to France. And he was in World War II, D-Day +3. So he was in the
he was in the thick of things.
The grave burial part. So he had to pick up all the pieces and do whatever he had to do. So, and then it took him forever to get back home, but he finally made it.
Yeah.
And Susie's a faithful contributor to national defense. She volunteers at the VA. The Daughters of the American Revolution has a great tradition supporting the military. And at Rim Library in Mount Vernon, there's a statue honoring women in the military, and it is paved with bricks, each one engraved with the name of a woman from Illinois who served in the military. If you've never looked at that, stop there sometime, pay your respects. And I'd also like to say, we had a lovely member of Daniel Brush chapter, Admiral Brown. I think she retired about 10 years ago. At the time, I think she was the highest ranking woman in the military. Her specialty was communications. She had a great career. And I heard her speak about 10 years ago, and I don't know where she is now. But I hope the DAR continues to support the military.
I don't think I really need this. I just had a question. Did your parents meet in the military? I saw in their wedding picture, your father had a uniform on.
Interesting story. Before the war, my mother was from Detroit, my dad from Chicago, and my mother went on vacation to South Haven, Michigan. Oh, I'm sorry. My mother went on vacation to South Haven, Michigan. My dad had 4 younger sisters, and one of his sisters was on vacation as well. Somehow my mother and my dad's sister became best friends. And my dad's sister would send my mother's salamis to Paris. So if you read the book, you will see my mother had all these different boyfriends and all these different marriage proposals. And she said, I can't make up my mind. I have to go back home to Detroit and think about it. She was honorably discharged. She went back home to Detroit. My dad happened to have a sister living in Detroit. And at the end of the war, he was still in the military. He stayed in for another year or 2 afterwards, but he was still in the military. So he went to visit his sister in Detroit. The sister in Chicago set the 2 of them up on a blind date on New Year's Eve, 1945. On their second date, my mother said to my dad, for 2 cents, I'd marry you. He gave her 2 pennies. Those are the 2 pennies over there. They didn't throw anything out. So those are the 2 pennies. They got married 3 weeks after meeting, and they were married for 54 years till my dad passed away in 2000. So I guess when it's right, you know it's right. Yeah. Other questions, comments?
All right. We thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
And the people on Zoom, thank you too. They loved it.
Okay, thank you. And I do have lots of memorabilia and books for sale, and they're $20. And if you have a credit card, then they're $21. Okay.
Ladies, don't forget to, or everyone, please don't forget to fill out your surveys about the presentation, and Peggy will take them, and we will be holding a business meeting in the room. Are we doing it in the room up there? Yes, no? Yep. In the room, little small conference room up there. So look at the memorabilia, take a few minutes, and then we will meet in there and get our business meeting started. Thank you so much.
Thank you.